best forensic investigators, owner and principal forensic investigator for Trident Sec, and I didn't bring the rest of your bio up here, so it's on the website.
Don't worry about it. I can talk about myself for hours, right?
You know, I thought you would.
That's how you'll know that my presentation's halfway done. I'll get to the point where I'll be like, okay, that's enough about me. Now let's talk about something else. Thanks for that rousing endorsement in terms of forensics. Any guys doing forensics in here? Anyone? So there's a couple people back there. A little bit about myself background so you get an idea where I'm coming from. I'm prior law enforcement, so if you've ever talked to me, if you guys catch me in this stuff, I apologize for the some of the inappropriate or like dry or let's say, you know, a little dark-sided humor. When you work in law enforcement for 22 years, you actually develop a dark sense of humor, and sometimes some people don't appreciate that. And I apologize in advance for that. The other thing I want to apologize for is I'm from Arizona, and about 2 weeks a year I have an allergy thing going on. And apparently here in St. Louis, you guys have like green stuff. You got green stuff growing out of the ground. You got trees or green things growing out of the ground with like green stuff on top of them, and then green leaves growing out of that and other stuff. And apparently green is one of the things that I'm allergic to. So I'm kind of have this cough thing going on, so I apologize if that becomes a distraction. I'm trying to keep it under control. Better living through chemistry. Tried a couple of chemical combinations here, so I'm doing a little better right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about metadata. And I'm not going to, say a pro or a con or what my belief system is. But I will say, that after 22 years of law enforcement, I could have gone longer. I could have gone to 30 or so before I actually decided to retire. But at a certain point in time, I'm like, okay, that's it, I'm done. I'm tired of being part of the solution. I'm ready to be part of the problem. So I have, my own belief system about where some of the stuff might be going and some of the reasons why you might want to be concerned about it as an individual, but also as a corporation if you're actually storing metadata about people. And whether you realize you're storing metadata, how that can be used either against you or by other people to gain access to information. So we'll talk about the metadata, some of the stuff that's out there, some of the metadata tools that people are using to scrub metadata, or at least what they think is scrubbing metadata, and how you might be able to still go in there from a forensic standpoint and get access to metadata. And if forensic people can do that, who else can do it, right? Hackers can do it too. They know this stuff. The vast majority of the forensic tools we're using are just hacking tools for all intents and purposes. So what is metadata? Metadata is essentially data about data, right? So with the advent of computer systems, the amount of information available in the form of metadata has exploded. Because you're storing information about your file system, you're storing information inside the files themselves about what's going on inside the files. Plus, we also have consumer metadata, things like, we're going to look at some call data records. So when people talk about, I said I'm not going to talk politically about whether I think it's right or wrong, but when people say, it's like the NSA is storing your call data records. Everybody's like, well, it's just your metadata. I'm like, oh my God, it's your metadata. My hair explodes, what little hair I have left. So where does metadata reside? Well, it resides inside your file systems, inside the files themselves. Service providers have metadata about you, about where you're going on networks, what websites you're visiting, who you're talking to, what your content is potentially. Financial institutions have metadata in the form of what you're purchasing from your credit card records, your banking records. That's all essentially metadata. It's data about what you're doing in your life. And pretty much everywhere else. Metadata is just pervasive. It's everywhere. So when we talk about file systems and file system metadata, it maintains information about the files that reside on a storage piece of media, whether it be a hard drive or some other type of device. Access control list, ownerships, permissions, MAC times, file attributes. All of that information is metadata that is inside the file system itself that we use from a forensic standpoint, and bad guys use this stuff too. They use it a lot when we talk about temporal analysis. My forensic guys, temporal analysis, anybody know what that means? Basically, we're looking at relationships in time. So if I have your modified access created times, if I have events occurring on firewall, I can look at them on the file system and try and correlate what's happened at what specific time. So if that's the case, if we have a file on let's say a Windows XP system, and we take that file and create it at a specific date, I create it right now today, it's going to have a modified access created time today. Well, after Windows XP and later, there's a little difference in the way that they keep track of the file system times. If I create a file today on a Windows 7 machine on a desktop, and then tomorrow I look at that, what is the access time? Is it today or tomorrow? It's actually today. By default, after Windows Vista, everybody knows like Vista was such a great OS. After Windows Vista, Microsoft changed the default behavior of the OS and of the file system drivers. It doesn't store last access times anymore. Now we can go into the registry, if you go to this registry key, and actually change that to a 0 instead of a 1, then we start tracking access times again. So, I mean, how many of you guys, I'm sure all of you have some sort of access control system in terms of going into buildings and stuff where you have to swipe a card. It's kind of a nice thing to know, not necessarily when the first time that somebody swiped a card and the last time you changed the rule set. You kind of want to know when people are coming in and out of doors. And from a forensic standpoint, I see this a lot, even in enterprise environments where people haven't changed that back because they just do a default install of the desktop clients. And then when I have to look at the desktop clients that have been compromised for people to try and get into the infrastructure, I don't have last access times. And that's a huge problem for you because now it creates a problem for me too because now I can't say the last time a file was accessed. I can say when it was created and when it was last modified, but that's not really going to help me and it's not going to help you. So just, proselytizing that, it's like if you don't know whether your last access times are being maintained, check it, and if necessary, push out a group policy to just change that so you're maintaining your last access times. The performance of the new systems and with Windows 7 and later systems, you're not going to take a performance hit for it. File metadata. This is data that's housed in the file itself about the file. And there's a lot of different files that are out there that do that. Like the most common one that comes to mind is Microsoft Office, right? You have all the properties inside Microsoft Office files about what's going on, what the title is, who the last author was, when it was last printed, when it was last modified, the number of minutes that was spent on it. All of that type of information is metadata. And there's a bunch of other metadata that can be in there too. So, for example, any of you guys ever played with, let's just look at some of the other types of metadata that are out there. You have XF information. Where's XF information? It's inside JPEG files, right? Stored information about the file itself. That's imprinted usually by a camera. We have media files, JPEGs, audio files, all those types of things, PDFs, PSDs, if you're doing any graphical designers. Work a lot with Photoshop. A lot of information inside Photoshop about stuff like that. Plus, we have history files inside Photoshop too. So if I can get a file that's been manipulated with Photoshop as a PSD, or even sometimes as a JPEG image, I can actually tell you exactly how it was manipulated and what the history was with that. A couple cases a while ago, I didn't work on them, but there was a child pornography case where an individual actually posted a picture online, but actually used Photoshop to swirl his face out of it. There was a history on there in the metadata. They just looked at how he manipulated the picture, they reversed it, and eureka, guess whose picture we have now. And then geo-tagging information. You guys have all heard about geo-tagging stuff. Phones are mostly doing that. You have some devices that are actually geo-tagging where they're embedding geographical information into a specific file format. And you guys play with FOCA? Yeah, FOCA is actually an enumeration tool. And we're going to look at it real quick. What most people will use FOCA for from a hacking perspective is we're going to look at your file, if you have a URL or something else that's publicly facing, you can look at the data that's on there, pull the site down, pull the metadata, try and do directory traversals, or not directory traversals, but zone transfers and other types of things on that. It will actually then query Shodan to see whether or not you have any kind of stuff in there, but it also pulls your files and it'll look at those files with metadata. So we're going to look at some of the metadata that this tool will pull down, and then we're just going to kind of look at the file natively and see what this tool missed. And we might look at it with another tool as well and see what most of your metadata tools are actually missing that you might be giving to people. So let's just look at the FOCA tool here real quick. I can find it on my desktop. And what I did, not to pick on my former employer or anything like that, but there just happened to be a convenient target. They're public. It's like the government is just one more person in a giant sea of people that are out there. So I've already downloaded all this information. It takes some time, obviously, to download an entire site, especially when you're talking about a government site. So I've downloaded it. This is just publicly facing the internet stuff. And I pulled down all of the documents that they have on their various web pages. And give a second to load here. So it took about, I mean, if you have a big site, it's going to take you a while to do it. So we're not going to sit here and watch the lizards evolve while we would normally be doing that. It took about an hour and a half to get all this data down. So if we look at the tool itself, I talked about some of the other things that the tool will do. I'll just parse through the interface here real quick. We have all the network information. Tells you the clients and servers. You can drill down into that from that aspect of it if you wanted to do that. So there's part of your enumeration, right? Have the different domains that are inside the city of Tucson, website, any related domains that might be out there, the roles of all of those other types of devices and what they're doing, and you can actually then drill down into that and identify those. But we're going to be, and then they also have the vulnerabilities, which I won't pull up. You guys can look on your own if you're interested. But when I click on the metadata, I can come out here to the tool itself, and I can tell it, hey, go after all of these different types of file formats that are on there, recognize those, and then run those through Google, and then also you can run them through being an Exalead. I'm not going to run through Exalead because it requires some additional stuff that I'm not going to do here. But we can see here that we have just a whole bunch of PDFs, XLFs, documents, docx's, all kinds of different types of devices that are out there. So I'm going to go ahead and Control A all of those. Maybe I'm going to Control A all of them. I'm going to say search all of them. And I'm going to go ahead and pull the metadata for all of those. Right-click on it, and then extract all the metadata. And it's going to go through and it's going to look at all these different types of files and see what kind of metadata might be inside of those. So give it a second to complete here. And you're going to get all kinds of things like usernames. If they have shares, if they're pulling a document from a document template that's on a share, you'll get that information. Use that to help enumerate any shares that we might be able to go out or any servers that may not be publicly facing. Another thing that you'll see, if I went through and found a lot of these from a forensic standpoint, I run this occasionally, temp saves, right? What is the default behavior for Windows or for Word? Like every 10 minutes it'll temp save the file. Well, that temp save information is actually towards the footer of a lot of those files. So I've had a couple of situations where people are kind enough to send their extortion letter in the form of a Word document. Just telling you guys that's probably not the best way to do it because inside of that, in the footer, is their username and their temp save location so that when you actually go back and do a search report on their house and get their computer, you just find their temp file right there with all the data on it. So it's a standard joke, right? It's like you read somebody their rights. It's like this friend of mine used to joke about this all the time as the detective. And after 22 years, you get good at reading somebody their rights. And you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to the presence of an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, you have the right to have an attorney appointed for you. Do you understand your rights? What do they say? Yes. And you said, will you answer my questions? And they say, yes. And you're like, no, you don't understand your rights. It's like, if you're willing to answer my question, you really don't understand your rights. So it's going to do a little bit here. Let's get working a little bit more. And eventually what it's going to do is going to download all this information. I'm going to let it work a little bit in the background here. And I've already preloaded some of the stuff up. And one of the documents that's on here is actually a questionnaire for women in law enforcement that was posted on the site. And it has an officer's name and information in here about the officer, why they got into law enforcement or whatever else. And there's a picture here. So if we look at this with this particular document inside of the FOCA tool, let's see if we're done working on it here. Well, while it's working, let's look at it with another tool. So we can look at it with Harlan Carvey's metadata tool. And anybody played with Harlan Carvey's metadata tool? It'll actually just pull data from a bunch of different file formats. And we can look and see if we can actually get just a PDF of all of the different types of files that are out there that have metadata associated with them. This is just from his, a screenshot from his web page. In the tool itself, but drill down through here through the tool, and we'll get down to the areas where we have different types of file formats that have metadata associated with them. So you see some of them that are out here. There's page 1, there's page 2, there's page 3, page 4, and basically 5 pages. Maybe you can go a little farther here, page 6, into TIFFs and waves, XLS, zip files, supported JPEG methodologies. So you can see it's not just Word documents. It's not just PDF documents. There's metadata in all of these different types of file formats. And this tool will actually go out there and it'll try and pull some of the common metadata out of it. So we're done with this now. So if I look at my metadata and my metadata summary down here at the bottom, it says, okay, hey, there's 155 documents, 25 new Office documents with the XML format, PDFs, PowerPoints, XLS, etc. I can click on the users, and these are all of the users that have access to it. So, what is the standard things that you need for a password to get into a system? You have to have, who you are, what you know, and then you may have some other factors that are involved if you have multi-factor authentication. Well, might have simple authentication, which a lot of networks do. Who you are, which is your username, and what you know, we now have 50% of that, right? So, and it's pretty shocking the amount of people who actually have, if I can come in here and find an administrator account, like here's an administrator account, that was used, the administrator account was used to create 26 different documents. So I can then go look at those documents and figure out if there's any temp save file information in there. And then I can target a local user account, because most of these are probably local user administrators on a network machine. If I can then compromise the local machine, I might be able to get access to other areas of the network. You can drill down here, you can see folders again. Folders and help enumerate. There's a documents and settings in here with a username, so I can enumerate that way too. And I can drill down and look at a lot of different things. Emails. If I wanted to enumerate emails to then look and see what document that's associated with. If it's a recent document, now I can help spearfish against somebody, because now I have some idea of something they worked on recently, and then I can present myself as working on that same project or something else. So simple ways that you can actually use enumeration to do it. So let's look at that Paglinawan document again. I'm just going to drag that and drop that on my metadata interface to get access to that. Let me start a new project to make my life a little easier here. Restart the tool so I don't have to go through creating a new document. And this isn't actually the way the tool is designed to be used, but it works just fine this way. So I'm just going to drag and drop that document onto my metadata interface here. And I'm going to right-click and extract the metadata on it. And now I can drill down into my document and look and say, okay, here's the metadata for all that document. tells us where it's coming from. So this is my local machine, so that's not real helpful to me. But I've got a download date. I've got down here in the metadata time, I've got my original creation times for the document, what created it, the author or company. It came from the template, what OS it was on, the edition time. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot of useful information there. It's been pretty well purged of metadata, right? But if I look at it, what else did we have? We had a picture on there, right? So if I look at the picture, we know that pictures might have some metadata associated with them. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on that and save that out. And I did a right-click and save that out, and that's when we got this Save As document here. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that on FOCA here and see if we got anything additional on that. Reduce screen size here, make it my life a little more difficult. So my metadata, let's drag and drop that on here. I'm going to extract the metadata for that guy. And it shows up an additional file down here in my metadata summary. And the Save As document, there's almost no metadata in it. So if we're using an Office tool to purge our Office documents of metadata, they tend to do a pretty good job of the Office document information itself. What I tell everybody when you're looking at purging information from your metadata, figure out whatever tool you have. Go ahead and purge your metadata and then look at it with a hex editor just to make sure that you're not missing anything. Because if we drop this document into a hexadecimal editor, when we start parsing through the hex editor, there's the information about the text that's in the Office document. Come down through here through the text. What do I have here? Got a bunch of XF information. Okay, the information about what camera took the picture, when it was digitized, and everything else. So using this hex editor, I can come back in through and I find, where is it? Here it is right here. That's a JPEG header. So when I talk about a header, that is just, you Unix guys talk about magic numbers. That is a delineator that tells this is a JPEG file. So whatever extension I put on it, that's a JPEG header. Now I can carve through here to the rest of it and just look down, and a lot of this is just exposure to recognizing headers and footers. Come down here. This is all the picture itself. Some Huffman tables, some other stuff. Keep going. All of this is picture, is JPEG. Until I come down here, until I get JPEG footer with a bunch of hexadecimal 00s behind it, showing me that's the end of that segment of the document. Right here. FFD9 is the JPEG footer, and then I got a bunch of hexadecimal 00s till I get to the next segment of the. So if I were to carve out all of that from the hexadecimal, my JPEG header, my FFD9 to my FFD8 to my FFD9, and then I save that out, I get this Peglinawan JPEG image here. That was what was embedded inside of the Word document. So I take that document, or that image, and I throw that into FOCA or some other tool. And then I extract the metadata off of that. And we can see that we now can view all of our XF information. So we have our other metadata, the application. So I don't care how pretty you are, if somebody takes a picture of you, what they're going to manipulate it with Photoshop. So we can see that this was actually manipulated with Photoshop. It's got what camera took it. We've got the software that was used to manipulate it, our XF data itself, dot resolutions, Photoshop information, time and date stamps of when the photo was originally taken, exposures, ISOs, all of the other information that might be embedded inside of the actual thumbnail, which is part of the JPEG standard, which is in there. So this is all stuff that was inside, that when we looked at it with the standard metadata tool, at the actual file format itself, it missed, because this is embedded inside another file. So it's a compound file. We have a file inside of another file. So if you're using a metadata tool that's extracting stuff from your Office documents, and you have pictures or other types of things embedded in there, you may very well be missing that embedded information that's inside there. And you're then getting that out to the internet for people to utilize against you. Now, if you also have, we talked about it before a little bit about JPEG information. And one of the things that we can do with JPEG is we can actually do geo-tagging. Wait for it. The wrong one here. So we talked about compound file types. Word data, save as versus the carved information. Geo-tagging. So in the spirit of Cinco de Mayo, right? You got your sombrero, right? How many people were wearing their sombreros and their mustaches last night? So a picture of my lovely wife, which apparently I'm going to be paying for later. This was taken with an iPhone. So the iPhone was set to actually do geo-tagging so that you could actually look at some of that data for the geo-tagging. Now, if you're geo-tagging and you're posting information to the internet, or you embedded that same Paglinowan style image in there, let's go ahead and let's pull that document in. Let's look at it. Let me change this here real quick because my resolution has changed, and they're gonna complain about that later. All right. So if I now look at that document, pull that document in, and extract the data on that, extract it. We drill down into that, look at our other metadata and the XF information. At the very bottom, the XF information, we actually have the file headers, and there's also, oops, went past it, geotagging information. GPS latitude, longitude, sea level information, it's all in there. So if I were to then take that GPS information and plug it in, I would know exactly where that picture was taken from. Now, that has potential impact if you have pictures of specific people. From my standpoint, from a security standpoint for me, when I was working in law enforcement, I have concerns about obviously other people finding those pictures and then being able to locate where I live or whatever else, right? So these can be issues for you, especially if you have like kids. And you're worried about people taking pictures of your kids or trying to find your kids on the internet or find you. So if this were embedded in that Word document, would we be able to get this information? Yeah, we would. Unless we specifically took an effort to go in there and obfuscate that somehow or another and keep that, or strip that picture of its metadata information. So again, we talked about digital file format images for geotagging and for metadata. But we have other types of external metadata too, like cookies, HTML5 geolocations type stuff. All of this stuff can be used to keep track of people that are coming to your websites, where they're coming from, what the MAC addresses are that are associated with the devices that they're coming from, or at least their routers that are associated to them, that we can all use to figure out where they're located. Network associations, same sort of thing. If you are on any of your cell phone devices, they're keeping track of all of the networks that you associate with. And they're usually going to have geo-tagging or GPS locations of where those are. So when I look at your cell phone, I can figure out what networks you were on when you were there, and then I can track your activity back. Subscriber information and financial information, we've touched on a little bit of that already. Call data records. So let's talk about call data records and like the NSA, right? The NSA is keeping track of our call. They're actually kind enough to hold our call data records for us. So when we look at a call data record, what kind of data is on there? Well, we have the calling party, the receiving party, the start time of the call, the duration, cell site information, and then the type of connection that we have. Is it an SMS message? Is it a voice message? Is it multimedia? Is it just a registration, right? So when you go from one cell site to another cell site, you actually register with that cell site so that they can track and get your phone calls or your other data to you from the perspective of the vendor. So the call data records and just a sample call data set. If you want to just kind of look someday at what you can find with a call data record, you can go to this site. And what they did is there was a German company, it was a German media outlet, that actually just went and had one of their reporters get their call data records for like a couple months beforehand. And I just took a real small subset of that call data record to look at. When you look at just this really small subset of it, keeps changing back on me, sorry about that, guys. We look at the call data record, I just looked at a very small subset of these registrations. So you have this first one is just the general packet radio service, and it's just basically a registration to a cell site. Now they obfuscated and they didn't give you any information about what phone numbers the phones were going, outgoing or incoming calls. And we can do that to figure out who these people are talking to or who their associations are. But I just looked at the ones that were highlighted, and I have my GPS information in minutes and seconds in dot format as to where they're doing and what they're going at a specific point in time. So you just look at those first couple of ones that I looked at, and I highlighted those and entered those. But you can see this is just for a couple weeks, and all this GPS information about where people are coming from and going to. And we can put that information in a temporal type analysis and track where they're going. So receiving calls, the data sets. And just by doing that, just tracking it out, I don't know if it shows up very well for you guys, but you can see that his day started here, and he got on a train, basically, at least what it appears from. And you can use Google Earth or whatever else, track out those ones, look at the actual locations that he's even just coarse, very coarse type of activity in terms of which cell sites he's registering with. And I tracked him all the way down through Germany to a specific location down here at the very bottom. And this is just looking at very coarse information. And inside that coarse information, I can do other things like, if I know what cell site he's at, and they'll give you what antenna phase he's on. So most cell sites or antennas have multiple faces. So I know which face he's on. If I know what antenna he's next to, if I know the antennas that are around him, I can narrow it down even further to where he might be, okay, or where he may have been. And this comes in handy from a forensic standpoint, because if I have your cell phone and you were at a location, or I suspect that you were at a location of a crime, and you actually say, oh, no, I wasn't there, I was somewhere else. I was over here at Grandma's house having Thanksgiving dinner. Well, that's interesting, especially when your cell phone is at the location of the crime, right? Because most people take their cell phones with them. So if I can look at stuff like this, I can figure out, where you're going, who you're associated with, right? Because wherever you're stopping at a specific point in time, if your morning starts every day at a specific location and ends at that same location every day, what do I now know? Where you probably live. I probably know where you eat lunch. If you have a girlfriend, I'll probably figure out where your girlfriend is, right? So I could give that information to your wife. So if you didn't want to know that, where you're sleeping, who you're calling, all of that type of information can be gleaned just from metadata in and of itself. Cookies preferences. Again, with preference cookies and advertising cookies, we've heard now that the NSA and some other agencies are using those preference cookies and advertising cookies to figure out where you're going and to be able to locate that information back to a specific device as well. APLR stuff. Anybody? You guys do in everybody from the St. Louis area here? Anybody from outside of St. Louis? They do automated license plate recognition here, where they actually have the police officers with the cars that have the special equipment, and they. So let's talk about APLR stuff. So that's what they look like. There's some other ones that look slightly different, but the International Associations of Chiefs of the Police actually put out a document in 2009 talking about APLR, or what they call LPR, license plate readers. And they talked about how they're PII, there's how they are presented with the situation that license plate information may be personal identifying information. They talked about its potential for abuse. They talked about any legal and any ethical issues that are out there. So what did they come up with? Well, APLR, they said license plate readers, they came up with this nice little information in their document. It says National Institutes of Science and Technology, Guide to Protecting PII, and we talked about the fact that you can use or uniquely identify somebody from a license plate. In Missouri, are your license plates registered to a vehicle or are they registered to a person? Vehicle? Yeah. In Arizona, we actually, if you have a license plate, like I have a license plate for my vehicle, the license plate is actually registered to me. So when I change vehicles, my license plate goes with me. So, I mean, that's even more PII, right? So they went through and they said, yeah, they're PII. But because we have, because we actually have to look at two different places to get the information, we have to look at the license plate itself, and we have to go to the motor vehicle registration to figure out who it might be, that's one reason why it's not necessarily truly PII, even though it's like PII. And then they said beyond that, we're the cops, right? We're only looking at for good reasons. So how many of you guys believe the man, right? So I was the man for 22 years, and I don't believe the man. So I know that, yeah, there are good cops, and there's lots of good cops, but there are certainly bad cops. There's bad apple in everything. So the problem with me when I start looking at like PII information or LPR information or letting the government hold my data for me is that not necessarily that it is being abused, but it's ripe for abuse, right? We have now the ability for it to be abused more easily than what we might otherwise. So, and then there's also this other issue that we have, and this is why we have this train of thought. Any attorneys in the room? There's one attorney in the room? Okay, so I'm not an attorney, but I do play one on TV. But the idea is basically the fact that you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in public records. So because this is a public record, or because it is held by some third party, in this case, well, in the case of this information, it's slightly different than your call data record, but it's held by a third party, so you have a diminished reasonable expectation of privacy. And since that is the case, the government doesn't necessarily need a warrant to get that information. So with this type of stuff, and especially when you talk about CDR information, or call data records, they're really looking at it more like a business record. So if it's a business record, I can either get it directly, either through purchase, or potentially I can just get it through a subpoena. And from a standpoint, as a law enforcement officer, generally speaking, if I want to investigate something, I have to have some legitimate reason to be investigating it. If you're walking down the street, can I just stop you and ask you questions? Well, yeah, I can, but if I'm doing that from a perspective of a legal investigation, I need to be able to articulate what's called reasonable suspicion. I have to be able to indicate somehow, some way that I think you're involved in a criminal activity and that it's afoot. Well, if you just are going down the street running license plate numbers, just grabbing license plate numbers, can I reasonably articulate that I think that you're involved in a crime? No, not really. So, I think they're starting to get in the gray area here. And as a person, you may say, oh, well, you're just a liberal cop, right? We have conservative cops and liberal cops. I, for a long period of time, was actually what I would consider a more conservative cop, or a more aggressive cop in terms of actually going after law enforcement type stuff. And I actually, as one of the cops that's fortunate enough to go out there and have a U.S. Supreme Court case that I've stood up and actually lost, I think I understand better than most what's going on. Because when you actually had a case where you go up to the U.S. Supreme Court and they're like, okay, this is what the law used to be, and you were operating under what used to be the law, and now thanks to you, everybody gets to change. So the license plate reader stuff, it concerns me because of the fact that they're housing the information for data mining. And that becomes an issue for me in the grand scheme of things. And I don't know what your train of thought is. But when we talk about APLR stuff as well, not only do we have the government starting to house that information, but we have the businesses that are selling the data actually housing the information too. So now we have some other questions about, okay, if you're housing it for the government standpoint, now you have the vendor who's actually providing it, actually housing information as well, and then they're using that information to sell a product. So they're actually selling this National Vehicle Registration Service that you can register for, and all of the APLR information that's going through those systems, they're storing the data about where those license plates were at a specific time. Register for the service, you can figure out where cars were and where cars are. All right? So what is some of the takeaway that we have here? It's like, know what metadata is present on your files, in your files. Don't just trust a metadata tool. When somebody presents you with a metadata tool, whether it's Microsoft Office, purging utility, or anything else to purge that metadata, when you're done with that tool, break out a hex editor, look at it. Look at it with a hex editor, look at it with the native tool for that file type, and see whether or not you can identify artifacts in there that might present somebody the ability to do just what I did, right? Take a compound file, a file embedded inside another file, and get the metadata back out of it. If you are storing or maintaining data on your clients, external actors may want that data. Those external actors, they could be hackers, they could be the government, they could be any number of other people. So if you're storing the data, and I can tell you from a law enforcement standpoint, as a detective for years and years and years, if I found out that you had data that you were maintaining in a personal database that might be advantageous to me in my criminal investigation, guess who's getting a subpoena or a search warrant? Okay. And I'm going to try and either get that data from you or compel you to give me that data. So if you are concerned about the privacy of your clients or whatever else, be aware of the fact that if you are storing that data, even if it's for a business purpose, the government may go after that data. All right. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Comments? Yes, sir. Yeah. The way that the question was, if you guys didn't hear it, how are those license plate readers working? Are they scanning active databases or whatever? What they're actually doing is, as the officer goes down the street or goes to a parking lot, it just recognizes the license plate, it queries that license plate, and then it'll run a criminal history check against it, as well as a registration check against it. That way, you can look at the registration, see who it's supposed to belong to, whether or not the registration is current. Looks at information in the criminal history to see whether or not there are any warrants associated with that individual or that vehicle. In real time. Yeah, well, the query time that it takes and latency issues, but relatively speaking, in real time. And I don't have a problem. I mean, it's like could take it for what it's worth. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is that now they store that data and house that data, and then they mine that data later on. So later on they may say, oh, we had this vehicle, let's go back and see if we had this crime in this area, let's go back and look and see. I don't have a problem with that necessarily either, but I'm starting to get a little grayer here because now you're starting to track information. And it even gets even more gray for me when the vendor starts housing information for their own private use, right? Because now you're kind of getting that in that area where now you're taking law enforcement information, and now it's starting to kind of push into the private space, which is a concern for me. Yes, sir. Yeah, exactly. I think that's, and you bring up a good point, and that's exactly the point that the government's looking at. Is this is publicly available information. It would be the same as me driving down the street, looking at you, and seeing you that you were at a specific location, right? There's no privacy implication there. The problem, I think, with technology now, we're starting in this gray area where a reasonable person, like an officer, you know, because we always have this fictitious reasonable person. Right? The officer is always the reasonable person. So what can I remember? I can only remember a certain point. It's like you may walk down the street and you may be able to remember every house that you went by and every vehicle that drove by you if you have a photographic memory. But can you remember that a week later? Can you remember that a month later? Can you remember that a year later? So that's the issue. It becomes housing these huge data sets that now I can mine through back later to see if there was a specific vehicle at a specific location at a specific time. So, you know, make your own decisions about what you think and, you know, how big brother-ish you want to get. But, yeah, and that's the reason we can do this, is because from a constitutional standpoint, you are in a public place in your vehicle. You're driving down the street, plus you're probably driving hopefully you're driving a registered vehicle, which is considered a privilege, not a right. So there's reasons why they can do that. And now with the technology, we probably have to start maybe thinking about, okay, where are our privacy rights going to go in the future? Yes, sir. Yeah, the question was whether we're seeing a lot more organizations now trying to scrub information about metadata or metadata that's in files, because it can tell you information about obviously the business and business processes, but it can also, if you have third-party information. For example, if any of you guys post stuff up to Facebook or photo buckets or other stuff, depending on the way that it gets posted up, some of the clients will actually take and scrub that metadata out of the information that gets posted up to specific locations. Now, like, for instance, if you use, I haven't actually tested it, but I was looking at the behavior a while ago, and if you use a photo bucket media client or phone client and you push the data up, it looks like it's purging the metadata from the images. But if you load it from your computer and load it up via that way, it looks like the metadata is still retained. So sometimes I would see where there should be metadata where the data was gone, and other times, other images I would look at, the metadata was present. So it depends on the performance of the tool, but you're starting to see a lot more organizations that are purging that metadata to avoid those PII violations. I think it really depends on what type of business that you're in and what kind of public-facing portals you have. So if you're putting stuff on the web, on a website that people can get public access to, that's one thing. If you're emailing documents, That's another one. So I think there's multiple controls that you have to look at depending on what your workflow and your business processes look like. Yes, sir. Yeah, I said I'd have to test it, and I probably will, but I think that if you look at how you're posting things up, look at the behavior of the clients, and I think depending on some clients were purging data, and some other clients were actually leaving the data in. So I'd have to research that some more to find out for sure why some do and some don't. Yes, sir. Well, I can tell you, if I'm law enforcement, one of the things that I would consider, I mean, just because I mentioned before that I'm kind of an aggressive person, if I was still in law enforcement and I wanted to go after a specific location, there's certain things that you can't do as law enforcement, right? So if I can't do one thing as law enforcement, if I can then contract with an agency or a private company that's doing that as part of their whatever service and then selling that service to a public, I can now purchase that data because it's generally available to the public and potentially use that data. So I'm not saying necessarily that, yeah, if you were a government, you couldn't necessarily then form a private company if you were, say, an intelligence agency to have a company do that. And then technically they're working as an agent for you, but if they're doing it secretly and unbeknownst to anyone, then that's one way they could potentially get around data. When you talk about like license plate readers or the same issue that they have with red light cameras or photo radar type stuff, you have a private party, private company that's doing that for you. I can now buy that data from them and actually use that data in an investigation if it was something that I normally wouldn't be able to get without a search warrant. Because it's publicly available, anybody can buy it.
I'm cutting you off, Rob.
All right, I'm talking too long. So if anybody has any other questions that they want to touch base with me,
buy him a drink and he will keep talking for a long time, I promise.
So I appreciate you guys coming here, and hopefully you enjoyed ShowMeCon.
But don't leave the room, I have an announcement.
Great venue. And then we'll let him do his announcement, and I'll get out of your hair.